Blade had followed blood trails across continents before, but this one felt different from the first quiet step. It did not scatter like a frightened animal. It moved like a unit returning to a base. In the mountain towns of Eastern Europe, the nights were old and heavy, and the locals still locked their doors as if the dark had hands. Blade listened to the same rumors in different languages. Men in tailored coats, pale faces that never sweat, black cars that never stopped for checkpoints, a predator that did not feed in alleys but selected targets with the calm of paperwork. He found the first body in an abandoned slaughterhouse that stank of rust and cold fat. Not drained, not torn apart. The throat was opened clean, almost surgical, and there was a mark on the skin that was not a bite. A stamped bruise, like someone had pressed a seal into flesh. Blade touched it and felt the anger rise, the familiar heat of his own cursed biology, and he forced it down. Control was his religion. Purpose was his leash. Whatever did this wanted the world to think it was just another vampire kill. But the scene was too tidy, too intentional, like a message written in silence. He tracked the killer through back streets and rail yards, through a city whose concrete was still stained with old wars. At midnight, the trail sharpened. Fresh cigarette ash, a faint chemical scent under the iron of blood, like weapons oil. Blade climbed a rooftop and saw them below, not one vampire, but three, moving together. They did not lurk. They patrolled. Their coats hid body armor. Their eyes scanned corners with training, not hunger. One of them paused, head tilting slightly, as if hearing a frequency humans could not. Blade froze, perfectly still, and watched the vampire make a small hand signal. The others shifted formation without a word. That was the moment Blade understood. This was not a lone monster. This was a cell. He followed them to a subway entrance half collapsed from neglect, a stairwell swallowed by graffiti and damp. The city above was asleep, but the air down there was alive with movement, distant metallic echoes, and the faint tremor of machinery. Blade descended, senses narrowing to the essentials. He could smell the underground. Mold oil, old electricity. And beneath it, the unmistakable copper bite of fresh blood, not spilled by accident, but poured into the dark like bait. The tunnel opened into an abandoned platform where old advertisements peeled like dead skin. Lights flickered in long, sickly pulses. The three vampires were no longer alone. More of them waited in the shadows, aligned along pillars, weapons cradled with professional indifference. Their faces were calm, almost bored, like soldiers waiting for a signal. Blade stayed high, balancing on a maintenance walkway, and watched the scene assemble itself. Then the other side arrived. A sound like nails dragged across stone rolled through the tunnel, followed by snarling voices that were not quite human. The darkness at the far end broke into motion. Shapes surged forward on all fours, then rose into a sprint. Blade realized, though the word felt wrong in his mouth, like naming a myth and finding it breathes, they were not feral strays. They moved in coordinated waves, flanking, advancing, covering angles. One carried a bag that clinked with metal. Another signaled with a flash of a small light, and the pack responded instantly. The first shot cracked the air. Not a pistol, something heavier. The vampires answered with disciplined bursts, muzzle flashes strobing against tile and grime. Lycans slammed into cover, then rushed again, faster than any human could track. The tunnel became a storm of gunfire, claws, and bodies hitting concrete with the weight of wrecking balls. Blade watched a vampire take a hit and keep moving, his face barely changing, like pain was a minor inconvenience. He watched a Lycan leap, twist midair, and tear a rifle from a vampire's hands as if it were a toy. Blade had hunted vampires in nightclubs and penthouses and sewers. He had seen monsters hide among humanity like stains that could be scrubbed out. But this was different. This was not infestation. This was infrastructure. It had ranks and weapons caches and tactics. It had a battlefield. A grenade went off, not with flame but with a concussive snap that rattled the platform. Dust fell like gray snow. The lights died completely for a second, and in that pure black, Blade heard the true music of the fight. Teeth clicking, bones shifting, men cursing in ancient languages. The low, controlled commands of vampires giving orders like officers. The answering howls of Lycans that sounded less like rage and more like signals. When the emergency lights were turned in red, Blade saw the floor dotted with bodies, but neither side was retreating. They were committing, reinforcing, escalating. Somewhere deeper in the tunnels, something metallic screamed along rails. An unseen train car moved or was pushed, used as a weapon or a shield. Blade felt the old familiar certainty in his chest crack slightly. He had come for one target. A single kill. A small piece of order restored. But the scene below was not a hunt. It was a war, buried under civilization like a second city, and Blade had just stepped into its front line. Blade did not jump in right away. That instinct had gotten plenty of good men killed, and Blade was not interested in dying for someone else's rules. He stayed above the platform, moving along the maintenance walkway like a shadow with a pulse, watching and learning. In his world, vampires were predators with egos, scattered clans feeding on weakness and nightlife. Here, they fought like a state that had been alive too long to be surprised by violence. He saw hierarchy in the way they moved. Older vampires stayed back, directing fire and positioning, while younger ones pushed forward like expendable blades. Their weapons were not stolen human guns, but custom-built tools designed for this exact enemy. Silver rounds, UV projectors mounted under barrels. Magazines swapped with calm speed even as claws scraped concrete inches away. They did not improvise. They executed doctrine. The Lycans matched them in a different way. They lacked the polished arrogance, but they had discipline born from desperation. They used the tunnels like a map in their blood. They baited the vampires forward, collapsed angles, and hit from multiple sides. Blade watched one Lycan deliberately expose himself, take a burst of fire, and keep charging long enough for two others to close the distance. It was insurgent warfare. Sacrifice as strategy. Blade listened to their voices. The vampires spoke with cold confidence, as if the underground belonged to them by default. The Lycans snarled and shouted, but between the rage were words that sounded like plans, not madness. This was not chaos. It only looked chaotic because humans were not meant to witness it. And that was the next realization, the one that sat heavier than the gunfire. Humans were not part of the equation. Blade spotted a security booth near the far stairs. Inside, a dead guard slumped in a chair, throat split, eyes still open toward a monitor that showed the platform in grainy black and white. The screen kept recording, obediently capturing a war the city would never admit existed. Blade understood the message in that corpse. No witnesses, no loose ends, not even the illusion of safety. Another body lay near a vending machine, a woman in a winter coat, her hand still clutching a phone as if she had tried to call someone who could save her. The vampires stepped around her without looking. The Lycans sprinted past without stopping. Both sides treated the dead the same way, as clutter. Blade felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He was used to being hated by vampires. He was used to being feared by humans who could not understand what he was. But he had always believed, even if he never said it out loud, that the point of his war was protection. That the monsters were the problem and people were the reason. Down here, people were not the reason. They were the wallpaper. The battle shifted deeper into the tunnels, pulling the vampires after the Lycans like a hooked fish. Blade followed from above, keeping distance. He passed rusted maintenance signs in languages that changed every few meters, evidence of borders shifting over decades while the underground conflict stayed the same. He heard trains above, normal life continuing, the city unaware it was built on a throat full of teeth. In a wider junction, Blade saw something like a command post. Vampires moved in and out of a side passage where crates were stacked with military precision. Some carried tablets and radios. Blade caught a brief glimpse of a symbol on a case, a crest like an old aristocratic seal. Not a gang mark, a house mark, a lineage claiming ownership. The Lycans, in turn, had their own organization. Blade watched them retreat into service tunnels that looked too narrow for bodies that large, and yet they vanished into them like water. He saw caches hidden behind panels, bags of ammunition, stolen equipment, makeshift explosives. They had been planning this for a long time. Blade's mind did what it always did. It built a map. It asked the quiet questions that kept him alive. Who funds the vampires? Who arms them? Who commands them? Who leads the Lycans? Who coordinates them? How do they move so freely through infrastructure? And the question underneath all of it, the one that tightened his grip on the railing. If neither faction protects humanity, then what exactly is humanity to them? The answer came in the way the vampires aimed their weapons. They never fired upward toward the city, even by accident. They kept the fight contained. They kept it secret. That meant the surface was not sacred. It was simply useful. Blade realized he had stumbled into a conflict that had rules older than governments, and those rules did not include mercy. It was not simply monsters hiding in the dark. It was monsters managing it. And Blade, watching from the shadows, began to understand the shape of the world he had entered. A world where the night was not a criminal habit but a civilization. A world where the war never ended because ending it would require someone to care about the people caught in the middle. Blade cared. That made him dangerous in a way neither side was prepared for. The first time Blade moved, it was not because he wanted to prove something. It was because he saw a child. The fighting had spilled into a maintenance corridor that connected to a street-level stairwell. A door above had been forced open, and cold city air poured down the steps. 3 civilians had wandered in, drawn by panic, trying to escape something above, only to find something worse below. A man held a flashlight with shaking hands. A woman gripped a child to her chest. Their faces were white with the same disbelief Blade had seen 1,000 times. The moment normal life realizes it has been living next to hell. A Lycan burst from the shadows and slammed the man against the wall hard enough to crack tile. The flashlight clattered away, spinning light across the corridor. The child screamed. The sound cut through Blade like a blade. Blade dropped from the walkway and landed without noise behind the Lycan. His sword came out in one smooth motion, silvered edge catching the emergency light. The Lycan turned too late. Blade drove the weapon through it with brutal efficiency, not savagery, then yanked it free and stepped aside as the body collapsed like a broken machine. The civilians stared at him. For a second, they did not know if he was salvation or another nightmare. Blade did not reassure them. He did not have time. 2 vampires appeared at the far end of the corridor, drawn by the scream. They raised their guns and saw Blade standing over a dead Lycan. For a heartbeat, confusion flickered across their faces. A human in the middle of their war, armed like a myth. Then their expressions hardened into decision. They fired. Blade moved. Bullets punched the wall where his head had been. He closed distance faster than they expected, and his blade cut through the first vampire's weapon, then through his throat. The second vampire tried to retreat, but Blade kicked his knee sideways, heard it snap, and finished him before he hit the ground. The corridor fell quiet except for the civilians breathing like they had been drowning. Blade pointed up the stairs with 2 fingers, a command that did not need words. They ran. Blade turned back toward the tunnels, and in that moment he felt it. Eyes on him. Not just one pair. He had just done what neither side would do. He had killed both factions without hesitation, not in the heat of battle between them, but as judgment. It was a message written in bodies. The vampires reacted first. Blade heard radio chatter spike, voices sharpening with alarm. He caught phrases in a language that carried old nobility, words that sounded like disbelief. Human. He saw movement in the shadows as vampires repositioned, no longer focusing solely on Lycans. Their muzzles angled toward Blade's last known location. The Lycans responded differently. The tunnels filled with a low growl that seemed to travel through pipes and concrete, a signal that called others. Blade sensed them circling, not simply attacking but testing. In their eyes, he was not prey. He was interference. A third variable in a war that had only ever been two-sided. Blade ran deeper, not to flee, but to avoid being pinned. He took a side passage and emerged into a service chamber filled with cables and dripping valves. A vampire stepped out from behind a generator, aiming a pistol fitted with something that glowed faintly. UV. The vampire's lips curled in a smile that was almost respectful. Blade threw a knife. It hit the vampire's wrist, knocking the gun aside. Blade closed in and drove a stake into the vampire's heart, then shoved the body into the dark. More came. 2 vampires from above. 1 from the left. Blade heard them before he saw them, heard the careful spacing of boots, the controlled breathing. They were hunting him the way Blade hunted monsters. That alone told him everything. These were not predators surprised by resistance. They were professionals. Blade cut through them, but it was not clean. 1 vampire landed a shot that burned Blade's shoulder with UV heat. A pain like sunlight poured into flesh. Blade gritted his teeth and kept moving, blood pumping hot, healing fast but not instantly. He was used to being stronger than humans. He was used to being hated by vampires. He was not used to facing vampires who fought like an army and carried tools designed to kill things like him. The Lycans struck in the chaos. A pair lunged from a ventilation shaft, slamming Blade into a wall. Blade felt the concrete crack against his back. Claws scraped across his vest, nearly finding skin. Blade jammed a silver blade up under a Lycan's jaw and twisted. The creature convulsed and fell. The second Lycan roared and swung. Blade ducked and fired a shotgun blast loaded with silver into its chest. It stumbled back, smoking, and Blade finished it with a sword strike that ended the noise. Blade stood in the ruined chamber, chest rising and falling. For the first time since entering this world, he felt the pressure of being outnumbered by enemies who did not fear the same things. Above, the city kept breathing. Below, the war recalibrated. Blade had stepped into their conflict and rewritten the rules. Now the tunnels were not just a battlefield between vampires and Lycans. They were a trap closing around the one hunter who refused to pick a side. And Blade understood the bitter irony. For the first time in this world, the hunter was hunted. Selene did not rush like the others. While vampires barked orders and Lycans snarled in the dark, she moved through the aftermath with a kind of stillness that made the tunnels feel colder. She studied bodies the way some people studied scripture. Every angle, every wound, every decision written in blood. She found the corridor where two vampires lay dead with their throats opened in a clean line. Not torn, not sloppy, controlled. She crouched, brushed her fingers over the cut, and felt the precision of it. This was not Lycan work. This was not the work of a panicked human either. This was the hand of someone who had done this many times and felt nothing while doing it. Further down, she found a dead Lycan with a blade driven through bone in a way that suggested strength and experience. The silver had cauterized the wound in a charred halo. Selene's eyes narrowed slightly. A human could not do this. A vampire would not do this to a Lycan unless it was forced. And yet the signs were clear. There was a third presence. She followed the trail, not with urgency, but with patience. Vampires were immortal. Time was a weapon if you knew how to use it. She moved through side tunnels and maintenance ladders, slipping between the lines of her own faction's search patterns. She preferred to hunt alone. Too many vampires saw a fight as a performance. Selene saw it as a task. She found him in a quiet section of tunnel where old posters had rotted into pulp. Blade stood near a dripping pipe, listening, waiting, as if the darkness itself fed him information. He did not look afraid. He looked annoyed, like the world had interrupted his work. Selene stepped into view with her gun lowered but ready. Blade's head turned instantly. His eyes locked onto her with the sharpness of someone who has lived by noticing threats before they exist. For a long moment, neither moved. Selene took in the details quickly. He carried himself like a fighter, not a criminal. His clothes were built for motion and impact, not for fashion. And his scent was strange. Human, but layered with something else, something that made her instincts hesitate instead of sharpen. Blade's gaze flicked to her weapon, then to her face. He recognized what she was. The calm way she held herself. The cold authority in her posture. A predator who had been trained to kill other predators. "You are not one of them," Selene said, voice steady, words simple. Blade answered without lowering his guard. "Neither are you." Selene felt the insult and the truth inside it. To Blade, she was a vampire. That was enough. But he had not attacked her immediately, and that mattered. Vampires did not hesitate to kill humans. Lycans did not hesitate either. This man had killed both, and yet he stood still now, choosing to read her before striking. "Humans do not move like you," Selene said. Blade's mouth tightened. "I am not here to explain myself." Selene took one step closer, careful, controlled. "You killed vampires. You killed Lycan." Blade's eyes did not soften. They were going to kill people. Selene stared at him. The answer was so blunt it felt alien. Not revenge, not politics, not pride. Protection. She had not heard that word in centuries without it being a lie. "You know nothing about this war," she said. Blade's laugh was quiet and humorless. "I know enough. Neither side cares about the ones above." Selene felt something uncomfortable shift inside her, a memory of what it meant to be human, distant but not completely dead. She had told herself for years that the war was necessity, that humans were ignorant and ignorance was safer. But hearing this outsider say it aloud, hearing the accusation with no fear behind it, made it harder to hide behind doctrine. Blade's gaze sharpened again. "You are a soldier." Selene did not deny it. "And you are what?" Blade did not answer directly. His hand hovered near his blade, not threatening, just prepared. "Someone who hunts monsters." Selene studied him, curiosity cutting through her training like a thin knife. Vampires could infect. Their bites turned humans into new vampires or left them dead. Lycans spread their curse in their own way. Yet this man walked through both like a fixed point, like something that did not belong in their equations. A distant howl echoed through the tunnel system. Selene heard the response of vampire radios, the tightening net. She looked at Blade and saw something familiar, something she had not allowed herself to name in a long time. A hunter trapped inside a war that was bigger than him. Blade looked back at her and saw it too. Not an ally, not a friend. A mirror with fangs. Neither attacked. Not because they trusted each other, but because both understood that the next move would decide what kind of story this became. And in the dark beneath the city, two predators stood still, listening to the war approach, and wondering if the old rules could survive what had just entered their world. The council did not see Blade as a mystery for long. Mysteries were tolerated only when they were useful. Blade was not useful. He was disruptive. He killed vampires without permission and interrupted operations with no regard for tradition. The council's response was predictable, ancient, and arrogant. Capture him, not because they feared him, but because they needed to prove that nothing could exist outside their control. Blade felt the shift in the tunnels before he saw it. The war sounds changed. Less random gunfire, more deliberate positioning. The vampires began to move like a tightening circle. Blade slipped through maintenance routes, climbing ladders and cutting through service corridors, but the net kept forming. These vampires knew their underground like a palace. Every exit had eyes. Every passage had a plan. In a wide chamber where old train cars sat rusted on dead rails, Blade stopped and listened. He could hear hearts that were not quite human, steady and slow. He could hear boots on metal above him. He could smell cold perfume and gun oil. He was surrounded. A voice echoed from the darkness. Educated. It spoke as if Blade was already owned. "You are far from your world, Hunter." Blade's jaw tightened. He did not reply. Figures emerged at the edges of the chamber, vampires in tactical gear, their faces pale with the confidence of centuries. Their weapons were raised but not firing. They wanted him contained, not destroyed. That was the insult. They believed they had time to play. Blade moved first, as always. He fired a burst that shattered a UV light unit and plunged one side of the chamber into deeper shadow. He sprinted toward the nearest vampire, blade flashing, and for a moment it worked. Two went down fast before the others adjusted. Then the council's trap revealed itself. A vampire dropped from above, landing behind Blade with inhuman softness. Blade turned, but the vampire was already inside his guard, moving with the speed of an older predator. A hand clamped around Blade's forearm like iron. Blade struck, elbowing the vampire's face, but the vampire only smiled, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that looked too clean to be natural. The bite came fast. Fangs sank into Blade's neck. For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to sensation. Pain, sharp and bright, followed by something colder that tried to bloom through his veins. Blade had been bitten before. He knew the feeling of vampiric infection trying to rewrite blood, trying to claim a body-like territory. But this time something else happened. Blade's blood fought back, not metaphorically, literally. The cold spreading through his body met resistance like a wall of fire. His hybrid biology surged, not in panic but in refusal. The vampiric venom hit his bloodstream and stalled as if it had entered a chemical environment it could not understand. Blade's heart hammered once, twice, and the infection did not take. The vampire's eyes widened. Confusion cracked its composure. It tried again, biting deeper, drinking more, forcing the transformation through sheer will. Blade felt the venom push, then break apart, neutralized by what he was. A dampier. A curse bred with a counter-curse. Blade snarled, grabbed the vampire's head and slammed it into the side of a train car hard enough to dent metal. He ripped the vampire off him and drove a silver stake through its chest. The body spasmed and fell, but Blade barely noticed. He could feel it in the air. The way the other vampires hesitated, their ancient certainty shaken by a simple biological fact. He did not turn. He did not kneel. He did not become property. One vampire stepped forward, eyes flickering with something close to fear. "What are you?" Blade touched the bite on his neck and looked at the blood on his fingers. His expression was cold, not prey. Gunfire erupted then, not controlled anymore, but desperate. Blade moved through it like a storm given shape, using the train cars for cover, closing distance, striking fast. Yet even as he fought, he understood what had changed. This was no longer about a hunter killing monsters. This was about the monsters realizing they could not make him one of them. That meant he was more than an enemy. He was an anomaly, and immortal societies hated anomalies more than they hated threats. Threats could be measured. Anomalies broke the math. In the tunnels beyond the chamber, Selene watched from the shadows, unseen. She had followed the council's movements out of suspicion, and now she witnessed the impossible with her own eyes. A bite that should have rewritten a man's destiny had failed. Blade's blood had refused the oldest rule. Selene's fingers tightened around her weapon, not because she wanted to shoot him, because she realized what the council would do next. They would not stop. They would escalate. They would dissect this mystery if they had to. And the Lycans, if they learned, would not see Blade as a human anymore either. They would see him as a weapon that could tip the war. Blade fought his way out of the chamber, bleeding but standing, eyes burning with controlled fury. He did not know the council's names. He did not care about their titles. He cared about one thing. They had tried to claim him. And in Blade's world, anyone who tried to put a leash on him learned the same lesson. His blood might carry a curse, but it also carried a decision. He belonged to no one. The Lycans learned fast. Word traveled through tunnels the way smoke traveled through ruins. By the time Blade reached the outer sections of the underground, the air felt different. Less scattered movement, more intent. He could sense bodies positioning in places where there should have been nothing but darkness. They had decided he was a problem. Not because he hunted vampires. The Lycans understood hatred. They respected it. But because he killed Lycans too, and worse, he did it with the same calm he used on vampires. That was not war. That was judgment. Blade emerged into a service station where pipes ran overhead like ribs. He paused, listening, and heard nothing. Then the ambush triggered. A metal door slammed shut behind him with a boom that echoed for seconds. Another gate dropped in front of him. The space became a box. The lights flickered, then steadied into a harsh white that erased shadows. Blade realized the setup instantly. They wanted him visible. They wanted him trapped. A howl erupted from above and bodies dropped down. 3 Lycans hit the floor like bombs, then rushed him from different angles. Blade fired, silver rounds punching into muscle and bone. One Lycan went down hard, smoking, but the others kept coming, ignoring pain like it was a rumor. Blade drew his sword and met the first charge with a cut that opened the Lycan's torso. It stumbled but still swung. Blade ducked under the claws and drove the blade up into the ribs. The creature convulsed and fell. The second Lycan hit Blade from the side, slamming him into a pipe. Blade felt metal bend and pain flare in his shoulder. He grabbed the Lycan's arm, twisted and snapped it, then jammed a stake into its throat. The Lycan gurgled and collapsed. Blade turned, expecting a pause. There was none. More came. They poured in through vents, through maintenance hatches, through any opening big enough for hate. Blade fought like a machine built for this. Shot, step, cut, pivot. But even he could feel the pressure mounting. His body healed, yes, but healing still required time, and time was what the Lycans were stealing from him with sheer numbers. A Lycan tackled him, driving him to the ground. Blade's head hit concrete, sparks flashing in his vision. Teeth snapped inches from his face. Blade shoved a silver knife into the Lycan's eye socket and twisted. The creature screamed and thrashed. Blade rolled away, got to one knee, and saw the real problem. This was not a random pack. It was coordinated. They rotated attackers, keeping Blade engaged while others repositioned. They were trying to exhaust him, to find the limit of what he was. Not to kill him quickly, but to prove he could be killed at all. Blade's breath came heavier. His muscles burned. His mind stayed cold. Then the vampires arrived. Gunfire cracked from a side corridor, controlled and sharp. UV beams sliced the air, forcing Lycans to recoil. Blade glanced toward the source and saw Selene moving with the precision of a trained executioner, her expression unreadable. She was not here to save him. She was here to deny the Lycans a victory. Selene fired into the pack, dropping 2 Lycans that had been about to flank Blade. Blade used the opening, surged forward, and cut down another. For a moment, the impossible happened. Hunter and vampire fought in the same space without killing each other. Not as allies, as intersecting goals. The Lycans hesitated, recalculating. They had planned for Blade. They had planned for vampires. They had not planned for both acting against them at once in this exact way. One Lycan, larger than the rest, roared and charged Selene. Blade moved without thinking, stepping into its path and taking the hit. The impact sent him skidding across the floor. Blade tasted blood. Selene's eyes flicked to him, a fraction of surprise crossing her face, then vanishing. She fired into the Lycan's side, driving it back. Blade rose, grimacing, and drove his sword through the creature's chest. The Lycan's roar died into a wet choke. The pack began to withdraw, not because they were afraid, but because the ambush had failed to produce the result they needed. They were treated like soldiers, dragging wounded, covering exits. Blade watched them go and did not chase. He knew the difference between victory and survival. When the last Lycan vanished into the tunnels, the service station fell into a tense quiet broken only by dripping water and distant train vibrations. Blade and Selene stood apart, weapons still ready. The light made their faces look harder, less human. Blade's neck still bore the bite mark. Selene's eyes tracked it with a thought she did not speak. "You could have let them kill me," Blade said. Selene's voice was flat. "And let them think they can control the war." Blade understood. Everything here was control. Control was the currency of immortals. Blade had no interest in their currency. Selene looked at him, and for the first time her cold mask thinned enough to reveal something else. Not sympathy, recognition. Because she had seen what it meant to be surrounded by enemies and still refused to kneel. Blade sheathed his blade halfway, not as peace but as choice. "We are not the same." Selene nodded slightly. "But you are in our world now." Blade's eyes narrowed. "Then your world is going to change." Selene did not argue. She simply watched him as if watching a storm approach a palace. The ambush had proven something to both factions. Blade was not invincible, but he was not breakable either. And in a war that had been locked in the same shape for centuries, even a small new truth could become an earthquake. The underground grew quieter after the ambush, not because peace had arrived, but because both sides were thinking. Blade moved through back routes and found a place to breathe, a dead maintenance room where the air smelled of dust and old paper. Selene remained nearby, not close enough to be trusted, but close enough to ensure neither faction caught him unaware. Blade did not thank her. She did not expect it. In the silence, Blade asked the question that mattered more than tactics. "How long?" Selene did not pretend not to understand. Blade exhaled slowly. He had lived a life of violence, but even his war had a horizon. A hope, however distant, that one day the hunting would end because the monsters would be gone or the world would finally wake up. "Why?" Blade asked. Selene's eyes shifted as if looking through walls into memories. "Because it is what we are." Blade shook his head once. "That is not an answer. That is an excuse." Selene's jaw tightened, but she did not shoot him. She spoke, and the story that came out of her sounded less like history and more like a curse recited from a book that could never close. Vampires had once ruled openly, she said, as aristocrats hidden behind power, feeding and breeding and building structures that outlasted empires. Lycans had been servants, then slaves, then rebels. A betrayal. A revolution. Names changed, cities burned, treaties were made and broken, and the hatred remained the only thing that stayed pure. Blade listened and felt the shape of it. He had heard similar stories in human wars. Different flags, same blood. But this was worse because time did not soften it. Time sharpened it. Every century gave the feud new excuses to survive. And humans, Blade said quietly. Selene's expression did not change. Humans live. Humans die. They are not part of the war. Blade stared at her as if she had admitted to something obscene. They are always part of the war. They just do not get a vote. Selene's gaze held his without flinching. "You think you are different because you care." Blade's voice hardened. "I am different because I still remember why caring matters." That struck something in Selene, though she did not show it. Blade could sense it anyway. Immortality did not erase emotion. It buried it under habit. Blade stepped away, pacing the small room. His wounds were healing, but his mind was restless. He thought of his own life. A mother bitten, a child born into a curse, a man raised into violence because there was no other way to survive. He had told himself that pain had meaning if it saved someone else from suffering the same. But here in this world, pain was not a path to peace. It was the point. He pictured the subway platform, bodies treated like debris. He pictured the council trying to capture him like he was an object. He pictured Lycans throwing themselves at him not to win freedom, but to win leverage. "Does anyone want it to end?" Blade asked. Selene's silence was the answer. Blade felt a grim understanding settle in his chest. This war was familiar, yes. Endless conflict, endless nights, predators hiding behind human ignorance. But it was worse because it had been normalized, institutionalized, a machine that fed itself. In Blade's world, monsters hid because they feared exposure. That fear was a weakness Blade could use. Here, the monsters did not fear humanity at all. They feared only each other, and now they feared an outsider who did not respect their rules. Blade looked at Selene. "You are a hunter." Selene's eyes narrowed slightly. "I am a death dealer." Blade accepted the title without reverence. "Then you should understand. A hunter does not kill for tradition. A hunter kills for purpose." Selene's voice was cool. "Purpose is what we tell ourselves so we can sleep." Blade almost smiled, but it was a bitter thing. "Maybe. But without it, you are just killing because you forgot how to stop." Selene's gaze drifted away, and for a moment she looked like someone much younger than her years, someone trapped in armor that had grown too heavy to remove. Blade felt no pity. Pity was useless. But he did feel something else. A question he had never allowed himself to ask. If a war cannot be ended, is it still worth fighting? Blade had fought his entire life because surrender meant more dead innocence. But here, innocence was not even acknowledged. The war did not protect anyone. It only preserved itself. Blade understood then why this world felt colder than his own. It was not the monsters. It was the absence of hope. Hope had always been Blade's quiet enemy and his secret fuel. He claimed he did not need it, but he moved as if he did. He hunted as if the hunt mattered. In the underworld, the hunt was a ritual. The war was a religion. And every religion feared the same thing. Someone who walks in and asks if it is all a lie. Blade's eyes hardened again, decision beginning to form like steel cooling after fire. If neither side would end the war, then the war would not end. But it could be changed. And Blade did not need permission to change it. He had never needed permission for anything. Selene watched him, seeing the shift, and she realized something that made even her immortal composure tighten. Blade was not trying to win their war. He was about to judge it. Blade did not announce his decision to the council. He did not bargain with Lycans. He did not ask Selene for alliance. He simply returned to what he was, the only identity that had ever fit him without compromise. But the hunt had rules now, and Blade wrote them himself. He would not join vampires because their order was built on ownership. He would not support Lycans because their rebellion did not spare the innocent. If this world offered only two masks, Blade would wear neither. He began to move through the city above and the tunnels below like a quiet correction. When vampires tried to harvest humans, Blade intercepted them. When Lycans planned attacks that would spill into civilian streets, Blade dismantled them before the first scream. He did not wipe out factions. He cut off the hands that reached for the helpless. That selectivity confused them at first. Vampires expected a crusader. Lycans expected a mercenary. Instead, they found a force that struck with surgical precision, then vanished before retaliation could form. Blade did not leave speeches. He left evidence. A patrol that never returned. A weapons cache burned into slag. A leader pinned to a wall with silver as if the metal itself was a verdict. Soon both sides started adapting, but not to each other. To him. Vampires changed routes, increased security, and tightened secrecy. Lycans shifted their movements, avoided certain tunnels, and set traps that were never triggered because Blade always seemed to know. Whispers began to spread through their ranks. Not a vampire, not a Lycan, not human, a thing that could not be turned and could not be reasoned with. Selene watched the changes ripple outward like cracks in ice. The war had always been a predictable rhythm. Strike, retaliate, retreat, repeat. Blade disrupted the rhythm with something neither side could counter. Principle. Blade was not fighting for dominance. He was fighting for boundaries. And in a world where monsters had lived for centuries without limits, boundaries felt like a new kind of violence. The council began to view Blade not as prey, but as a contagion. Lycans began to view him not as an enemy, but as a threat to their narrative. Because wars survive on stories, and Blade was writing a new one. A story where humans mattered. A story where immortals could bleed without meaning. A story where the night did not belong to bloodlines or rebellions, but to the one who refused to let the innocent be currency. Blade kept moving, quiet, purposeful, not as part of their world, as the thing that corrected it. Rain fell on the city in thin, cold lines, turning streetlights into blurred halos. Above ground, people hurried under umbrellas, heads down, unaware of the war beneath their feet. They lived inside the illusion the vampires had polished for centuries, and the illusion held, because most humans never look into the dark long enough to see eyes looking back. Blade walked through that rain like it was nothing. His coat was heavy with water, but his presence was heavier. He moved past storefronts and alley mouths and subway entrances, every reflection in every puddle briefly catching his silhouette and then losing it. He was a rumor made real, the kind that spreads without proof because fear does not require evidence. Somewhere below, vampires tightened their networks. Somewhere else, Lycans sharpened their plans. The war continued because it was too old to die easily. But it had changed. Now, when a vampire stepped into a shadow, it did not only wonder if a Lycan was waiting. When a Lycan stalked a tunnel, it did not only listen for the click of vampire weapons. Both factions had learned to fear something new. A hunter who belonged to neither. A warrior who could be bitten and remain himself. A presence that did not feed on power or vengeance, but on purpose. Blade paused near a subway stairwell, listening to the distant hum of trains and the deeper, quieter hum of hidden conflict. His hand rested near the weapons that had become extensions of his will. His face showed nothing. He did not need to smile. He did not need to threaten. The night already understood. In a world ruled by monsters, fear had always been the monster's gift to humanity. Now fear had changed hands, and as Blade descended into the underground once more, rain still dripping from his sleeves like dark ink, the city above kept sleeping, protected by a man who would never be welcomed, never be thanked, and never be claimed. The war beneath civilization would go on, but the night no longer belonged to vampires. It no longer belonged to Lycans. It belonged to the hunter.